Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we bring you a special edition of Bookshelf, in which we look back over the past year and each choose our top 3 favourite books of 2020. These are the books that we read outside of book club, the ones we got to pick and choose.
We've also drafted in our own book clubs to share their favourites. And as regular listeners to the pod will know, they're a well-read, critical bunch, so expect some interesting choices.
Plus, we've invited some friends of the show to share their favourite reads of the year and what they're most looking forward to in 2021. We'll be hearing from Seb Emina, editor of Penguin's Happy Reader magazine, Simon Thomas from podcast Tea or Book, and Claire Handscombe of US podcast Brit Lit.
All that coming up here on the Book Club Review. We haven't done a bookshelf for a little while, have we? Normally, we dive straight into what have you been reading lately, and I am quite curious, as I haven't spoken to you that much about our current reads for a while. What is the last book you read?
The last book I read, which I've just finished, was Sylvester by Georgette Heyer. I'm, as ever, slightly embarrassed to say. My friend Caitlin listened to an audiobook, which was Sylvester, after she read our article about Georgette Heyer and had heard us natter on and on about it on the pod. And I realized, I was like, I haven't read Sylvester. What's Sylvester? She's like, oh, it's my mother-in-law's favorite. So I read that. That was a delight. I very much enjoyed it. And then in a similar theme, I mean, this is just irresistible. I went to the local library. It's amazing. I never went to the library in London. I could have done, I suppose, but I never did. I left with like a stack of books and I felt like I was stealing. And one of those books was Sorcerer to the Crown by Zen Cho, which I believe was published this year. And you'll understand why I picked it up when I read you the quote on the cover, which says, "An enchanting cross between Georgette Heyer and Susanna Clarke, full of delights and surprises."
But did it deliver on that promise?
Well, so, you know what? It does deliver on that promise, but Zen Cho, it's her first novel, and she is, as yet, nowhere near becoming the next Georgette Heyer or Susanna Clarke. So, although the plot lives up to that, in that we have the Royal Society of Unnatural Philosophers in 18th century England, and the new Sorcerer Royal is Zacharias Wythe, who has inherited this mantle from his adopted father. And I suppose this, for me, is the book's strength, really, is that Zacharias Wythe is black. He was freed from enslavement by his adopted father when he was about 5, and his father wanted him to become a sorcerer. He wanted to prove that, you know, a black person could be a sorcerer, because this is the 18th century England. So there's that thread, and then he crosses paths with a young woman whose mother must have been of Indian descent, and she is an orphan in a school for girls where actually they're taught to not do magic because women aren't allowed to do magic. And they go off from there, and there's romance and hijinks. It is enjoyable. It's a bit underwritten. I wanted more, but I finished it really quickly. So, you know, one to try if you're in the mood.
Yeah, it sounds fun.
I think you would like it. I mean, come on. Your 2 favorite, Clarke and Heyer in one. Have you been reading more serious things?
Well, because there's a lot to live up to. That's the trouble, isn't it? I'm always slightly wary of things that promise to be like my favourites. I have been reading a children's book, little quote marks around it. It's The Dark is Rising.
Yeah.
A very well-known, well-loved classic. I was prompted to read it by Backlisted podcast, which no book-loving podcast listener needs me to tell them about, but just in case you haven't heard of it, it's this wonderful podcast where they look at old books from the backlist. Bringing new life to old books is their catchphrase, and they discuss them with a couple of guests usually. It's just a total delight. I absolutely love that podcast. For this one, they did The Dark is Rising, and they had Robert McFarlane and Jackie Morris on, who did that lovely book The Lost Words together. Don't know if you came across that one. A really gorgeous book.
No.
Rereading this book that I almost didn't remember so much as I remember having loved it as a child. And I read the whole series, but The Dark is Rising, I think, is the one that I reread. It's the second book in, I think there are 6 of them altogether in the sequence, but this is the one that I went back to quite a few times. And going back to it again was just such a delight because the writing is so good. It's by Susan Cooper, and the writing is amazing. And it's set over Christmas. It tells the story of Will Stanton, who's the 7th son of the 7th son. And it turns out that he is what's known as an old one. So he has this magical gift. He is part of a tradition of people who are somehow outside of time, and they are locked in this eternal struggle. They are of the light and they are fighting against the dark. And the dark is rising and trying to take over and dominate everything, and they're trying to fight against that. And Will turns out to be very important because he is the keeper of these symbols, these signs that hold great power. And so this book tells the story of how he gathers these signs together. And I mean, it's kind of extraordinary that it's a book written for children because, well, it has a child protagonist and aspects of it are very safe and cozy. You know, it contrasts this lovely domestic world of this family Christmas. I was thinking it's like Christmas as you want it to be. It's all about the beautiful rituals of the tree and the Yule log. And, you know, they have a TV, but they're not all watching the TV. They're not on iPads playing Roblox the whole time. You know, they're shopping for presents for one another and being together as a family. And you're reading it and you're like, yes, this is how it's supposed to be. But so you've got this cozy domestic world, and then set against this, you've got this really quite terrifying presence of these dark forces that are just awful. And and even rereading it, you know, I found I was totally chilled by it and totally gripped by it. It's the perfect Christmas read. I absolutely loved it. And yeah, I'd recommend it to anyone. They were talking in the podcast about it being pigeonholed as a children's book. And it's true, it's not a children's book. It's a book that, as they said on the show, it's for humans. It's for anyone who loves to read. Almost shot to my best things I read in 2020, but there are so many amazing things I read in 2020. It has been a real struggle to whittle it down for this show.
Well, shall we give listeners a sense of what we read in 2020? You know, a long list, if you will.
Yes, I've spent a bit of time feeling a bit tormented about all the books that I know we're not going to talk about. So yes, a quick long list. In mine, I've got Hamlet, Maggie O'Farrell, Girl, Woman, Other, Bernardine Evaristo, The Rat Line by Philippe Sands, Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. I discovered 2 really brilliant fantasy series, the Pellinor novels by Alison Croggan and the Shades of Magic series by V.E. Schwab. I also loved The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by her, and The Lovely Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I loved Shuggie Bain. I really loved a book I'm not sure anyone in the UK has ever heard of called The Regrets by Amy Bonafons. It's currently only available in the US, but if you fancy importing a copy, I can't recommend it highly enough. I loved Life Among the Savages by Shirley Jackson. I discovered Deborah Levy and her essay collections. I stayed up nearly all night reading The Devil in the Dark Water by Stuart Turton. I loved The Salt Path by Raina Wynn. And this is the year I discovered Neil Gaiman when I read Neverwhere. And I also read The Graveyard Book by him, which is a kind of Lincoln in the Bardo for children that I absolutely adored. It was so brilliant.
Very enthusiastic about many of those books. You had a good year for reading.
Well, it's that thing, isn't it? These are the books that we chose to read. You know, you tend to choose to read things that you think you'll like. And in my case, most of the time I do.
Well, on my long list, we have The Doorstopper, Mirror in the Light by Hilary Mantel, which, admittedly, I have yet to finish, but I will one day do it. And then there's a whole host of escapist reads. And maybe that's why I'm so impressed by your list and how much you enjoyed them, because I think you might have had a more challenging year than me. On my list of escapist reads, we have The Institute by Stephen King, meh. Hotel Pastis by Peter Mayle, enjoyable but problematic. Belgravia by Julian Fellows. The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow. Murder on the Nile by Agatha Christie. And I put it as an escapist read, but I too read the Pellinor series by Alison Croggan, at least the first book so far, The Gift. And then I also reread some of my favorite comfort books, including the fantasy classic Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, and French Street Hunting and Gathering by Anna Gavalda. And I note that isn't in your list yet, despite me giving you a copy a few months back.
I'm actually midway through it right now. It's one of 3 books that I've kind of got on the go at the minute.
Okay. And I did dip into a fair number of new releases as well. Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan, Devil in the Dark Water by Stuart Turton, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. And then I too read Deborah Levy's essays. My choice was The Cost of Living by her.
I love those essay collections. I quite like her fiction. I liked Hot Milk and I liked The Man Who Saw Everything, but I didn't love them. But when I read her essay collection, I loved that. I think I read it twice in one sitting because I just loved it so much. And I thought she was talking to me. You know, that thing where you feel like a writer is just speaking to you.
I listened to them. Well, you know, I would go on my coffee run in the morning with the baby and I would listen to one of her essays. And yeah, I felt like I had a friend with me.
So great. Okay, those are really great lists, but there are lots of books on there that I feel have been on so many people's favourite lists. Maybe we've heard enough about them.
It depends if they were your favourite. Were they?
I mean, So if I was to say standout reads for me from 2020, I would have to say Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I think the big surprise there was how much I liked it, given it was a Booker read, and I was sort of expecting it to be really worthy. And it's just so much fun, and it's so good. And Shuggie, Bain by Douglas Stuart, which is almost slightly a book club book, isn't it? Because we did it for our Booker podcast, but I haven't actually read it with my book club yet. So I still count that as my non-book club reads. But, you know, all three just amazing, amazing books that really moved me, had a powerful effect on me.
And all three have scooped up the awards, haven't they?
Yeah, award-winning, and, you know, no one really needs to hear me go on about them, I think.
Well, I feel like you and the literary judges of England are very much on the same page.
Yes, that's very gratifying, isn't it? And, you know, if I was completely honest, in terms of the number of times that I actually read them, I'd have to say my favourite books of 2020 were the fantasy series that I mentioned, The Darker Shades of Magic by V.E. Schwab. I loved them so much, I read them 3 times.
Where did you get the time to do that?
There was a point where I couldn't do anything else except read these books. They were all I wanted to read. And I kept picking up other books and reading a bit of them and being like, no, I'm just going to read it one more time. I must just tell people what they're about. So there are 4 Londons. There's Grey London, Red London, White London, and Black London. Grey London is kind of like our London, but it's set in the 18th century. This is sort of non-magical world. Mad King George is on the throne. Red and White Londons are magic. Black is so magic. It's a dark magic, and this world has been closed off, sealed off to protect the other 3. It's mainly set in Red London, and Kel, our protagonist, is a magician, as many people are in this magical world, but he is special because he has the ability to travel between the different worlds. And that's very rare. There's only one other person who's like him. And there's a powerful object that comes into Kel's possession that poses a huge threat. There's a girl called Delilah who he meets in Grey London, who ends up becoming this sort of magical pirate. There's the royal family that Kel is a member of. There's the Prince Ree, who's an important character in Red London, who gets caught up in it all. So there's this threat to the very existence of their world. And at the heart of it all is this really great love story between Lila and Kel. I could not get enough of these books.
Well, you might be happy to hear then that I have The Darker Shades of Magic on my bedside table. It was one of the books I picked up at the library last week.
I love them so much. And unfortunately, that thing has happened now where I've read them enough that the magic has slightly started to wear off. I can see through them now. You know, that's it. I've read them out. Okay. So with all those caveats
what are we here to do?
and asides, yeah.
Yeah.
Should we do, in favourite order, our top 3, maybe slightly less obvious choices?
Well, none of my favourite reads of 2020 are actually likely to be high on anyone's radar. 2 were even published over 50 years ago. A little teaser there for listeners. Okay, enough preamble. You get us started with your favourite non-obvious reads of 2020, starting in 3rd place.
Yeah, in 3rd place for my non-obvious reads of 2020. Although, you know, I considered actually putting this in 1st place because it was the book that felt more than anything else I read this past year to be the right book at the right time. And it's a book called The Well-Gardened Mind by Sue Stuart-Smith. We talked about it on our summer bookshelf show. I think it was sort of a bit buried in a mix of lots of things that we read. But at the time I raved about it, and I come back to rave about it again now. Sue Stuart-Smith is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist who worked for many years in the NHS, and she's married to a very successful and well-known, I think, in that world, garden designer called Tom Stuart-Smith. And this book is a combination of contemporary neuroscience and psychoanalysis and storytelling, as she looks into the idea that when we work with nature and we're connected with nature, that can actually really transform our mental health and our well-being and our confidence. And she tells all these stories of people that she's worked with directly or schemes in various institutions that she's visited where people have been given access to gardens and how that has helped them to grow, I suppose. It's kind of a cliche, but yes. and to flourish. And it felt like at that time when we were locked down in the middle of the year and general anxiety was so prevalent, everyone was sort of very worried and we were all trying to connect with each other, but we could only do it electronically. And many people, I think, took that time as an opportunity to reconnect with their gardens, or they were growing plants on their windowsills, or they were just going on walks and looking at trees. And suddenly that became something quite reasonable that you would do with your time because there wasn't anything else to do. And this book really helped me make sense of all that. It was just so wonderful. And I read bits of it again and again. It's just full of beautiful quotations and her own stories, her story of her grandfather who was a Turkish prisoner of war and lived through some absolutely horrific experiences. And when he came back, it was his garden that saved him and enabled him to put that behind him in a way. It was just a really beautiful book and incredibly readable. A real page turner. It's a sort of reasonably thick hardback, but I read it really happily and compulsively over 1 week in the summer, and it was great. So I really recommend it. It could have been my book of 2020.
I guess the competition was tough.
Yeah, it really was. And of course, I should say, I am not a gardener, and it was funny how interested I got in gardening during lockdown. And as soon as lockdown eased, I lost all interest in gardening and it went back to being something that I couldn't care less about. Really interesting how it's kind of like seems it's linked, but then it all kind of makes sense how it's all connected.
I also just think spring in England is one of the most marvellous times. It's one of the best places to be after those cold, bleak winters. I have so many photos on Instagram from that period of trees in bloom, all the cherry blossoms coming out.
Yeah, they make such a thing of it in Japan, don't they, with Sakura, the cherry blossom festival. And I just think if they came here to Islington, they'd go nuts.
Okay, all right. In third place, for my favourite read of 2020, we have Himself by Jess Kidd, which listeners might remember me talking about on a bookshelf episode back in the spring. This was a recommendation from Andy, who's one of my dear friends. He's also a lapsed member of your book club. If you're listening, Andy.
No, he's back.
Get it together. Oh, he's back.
I think he's back.
He's back.
He doesn't
Good.
like Zoom.
It's a tricky book to describe himself. It's a magic realist murder mystery, stroke, I'd say almost a comic caper with ghosts and madcap characters, and it's set in the small Irish village of Mulderig in County Mayo. Our hero is the handsome and charismatic Mahoney, who's returned to the town of his birth to find out what happened to Orla Sweeney, his mother, and the village harridan who disappeared 25 years earlier. Now, we know from the brutal but beautifully written prologue that opens the novel that Orla was beaten to death by her lover. But who was that? Who did this? The village isn't telling. Mahoney is greeted with dismay by many of the characters. There's a lot of stonewalling. They don't want to talk to him about anything. But as he digs deeper, he does find allies, particularly in the form of an octogenarian actress, as well as a few ghosts, because they're there. Another Lincoln in the Bardo motif cropping up. But the truth might be his undoing. Very dark, very funny, very Irish, I would say. I loved it. I listened to it on an audiobook, and I'd highly recommend that experience because the actor who read it out did perfect Irish accents. It's why I know to pronounce Mahoney's name Mahoney, despite the fact that it looks like Mahoney when written. It's great. I highly recommend it. Yeah. Third place. Top favorite read of 2020.
I read this one on your recommendation and I really enjoyed it too, although it was... I always think, the thing about crime novels is at their heart, there is always this sort of dark, distressing murder. And it's true that that's what stopped it being a real favourite for me. But what a great read. It was really good.
I thought what made it unusual was the care she took with Orla Sweeney's death and her circumstances and the tragic life she lived leading up to that. I mean, she was
really
the mother to this baby. I think she was only like 13 or 14 when she was killed. This was a child, and the village just treated her appallingly and then turned their backs on her disappearance, knowing that it couldn't have ended well. I don't know, there's just so much going on in this book, and I thought Jess Kidd did it really well.
Yeah, the ghosts are great. All right, so just to break up from you and me, shall we hear from a friend of the pod?
Who do we have?
One of the delights of doing this podcast for me is the way that it's connected me up with people in the book world that I probably wouldn't have crossed paths with otherwise. Our first is Seb Emina, editor of my favourite magazine in the world, Penguin's Happy Reader. For anyone who doesn't know it, it's a magazine that takes the idea of a book club as its format. They do a couple of issues a year, and they focus on a book of the season, which is always from the Penguin Classics backlist. The thing I like about Seb, one of the many things, is that he's in that category of what I think of as cerebral readers, He seems to exist in a world where he only reads the most interesting literary highbrow books, which is something that I aspire to, but I just can never really achieve. So here is his top read of 2020 and a book that he's looking forward to in 2021.
A book I loved in 2020 was In the Castle of My Skin, the novel from the 1950s by George Lamming. I featured it in the newsletter I've been doing for the Happy Reader, which is called Happy Readings. It was one of the most intensely transporting reading experiences I've had for a long time, just on a prose level as a work of literature. It was astonishingly beautiful how he used language and evoked this place. And it just kind of gave me access to a time and a mind and a location that I never would have known about otherwise. Colonial Barbados in the interwar years, and it did it in this breathtakingly full and rich way and evoked an atmosphere that I can still tap into just by thinking about the time that I read it about 7 months ago, and I think not many books can do that. And a book I'm looking forward to in 2021 is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I absolutely loved Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing what she's done now after so long.
I think he's going to love that book. And if you're interested, you can sign up to Happy Readings at thehappyreader.com.
Okay, what is your second book?
My second book is called Enter the Aardvark by Jessica Anthony. Part 21st century political satire, part unexpectedly affecting 19th century love story. This is about a Republican congressman, Alexander Payne Wilson, and he is determined that nothing will stop him in his campaign for re-election. Not the fact that he's a bachelor, not the fact that his main adversary, Nancy Beavers, married with children, is rising in the polls. Nothing. That is until one hot day in August, he receives a large parcel via FedEx. Inside is a gigantic taxidermied aardvark. This aardvark has a surprising history, from the Victorian naturalist who discovered it to the taxidermist who deemed it his finest creation. But for Wilson, the entrance of the aardvark sets off a chain of events that threaten to ruin his entire career. This, I think, popped up for me because it was on a couple of US summer reading lists that came out, and I idly thought, that sounds intriguing, I'll give it a go. It's so funny. It just grabbed me from the very beginning, really. This character, this Republican senator, he's not very likable. He's very vain, and he's concealing his sort of sexual identity because he's gay, but he's hoping that he's going to marry this preppy East Coast wasp type woman who he thinks is going to be the thing that will combat this rival of his, Nancy Beavers, because she's married with children, so he's going to go into this fake marriage in order to advance his political career. So it's just very funny about all of that. And then this thing about the aardvark. It's this huge aardvark that arrives, and then it flips back and forth the structure between this contemporary farce that's going on and the backstory of the aardvark, this sort of 19th century gothic romance in a way. Again, another unrequited love affair between two men, and then the wife who is sort of caught in the mix of all of this, and this aardvark, which it turns out has human eyes. There's a sort of chain of events that leads to the eyes of one person being put into the aardvark. It's quite weird, but it's just brilliant. The writing was so good, and it's not a long read, but it's quite detailed. So actually it took a lot longer to read than I thought it was going to. But that was just one of the pleasures about it, because I really wanted to savour it. It was so good. I normally hate farce, but I didn't mind this because it was just so well done. Normally I find farce really contrived, but I didn't with this at all. It was great. And, as just a very clever antidote to both coronavirus panic and also Trump, it was just so spot on and clever and just what I wanted to read. I haven't seen it on many people's radars over here, and it just seems a shame because it was brilliant. So I recommend it highly. Yeah, it's my second favourite non-obvious read of 2020.
I want to know, how big is an aardvark? Is it the size of a badger or tortoise?
In this story, I couldn't think. If you asked me how big an aardvark was, I would say I wouldn't think it was that big. But in this story, this particular taxidermied aardvark is very large and cumbersome and problematic when it needs to be transported. This is something to
Google afterwards.
Yeah, from place to place. It's like part of the joke is the difficulty he has in concealing this aardvark. So, yeah.
I think this book slipped under the radar of our bookshelf episodes. So I am glad that you have resurfaced it. Honorary position.
Yeah, I was happy to have a chance to talk about it again. I might reread it. I was thinking to reread it for this show, and of course then I got caught up in The Dark Is Rising, so I didn't. But I might go back to it again because I think it's worth a reread.
Well, in second place for me, which if people have been listening to us religiously, may come as no surprise, is West with the Night by Beryl Markham. I read this during the days of lockdown. It was also the days when my baby daughter would only nap for longer than half an hour if she was held. And so my husband joined me. It was lockdown. He couldn't work in the restaurant. And we would alternate who held her for an hour and a half when she woke up after 30 minutes. And so I read West with the Night with a snoozing child on me in her tiny little room. I'd crack the blinds open a little bit. And I loved it. And maybe the circumstances slightly informed that. But I've recommended it to other people since, and they equally adored it. Beryl Markham grew up in British East Africa, which is now Kenya. And she moved there with her father when she was a small child. They left behind her brother and mother back in England. And she grew up surrounded by the Nandi tribe, as well as Maasai warriors. And she sort of ran wild. And the opening stories in this memoir are about hunting in the wild and coming across lions and having to sneak away. Wonderful atmospheric writing. I can see it all now. Quite flowery, because I should say she moved there in the 1900s, I think. And then the book was published in 1942. And of course, Beryl Markham, if you have heard of her, you will have heard of her because she was a famous aviatrix. So she was a female pilot in British East Africa. And the reason the memoir is called West with the Night is because she was the first person to ever fly from Europe to North America. She actually crash landed in a bog in Nova Scotia. And towards the end of the book, she recounts that journey. At the age of 18, when her father lost his ranch and all his money, and he went off to South America, and she stayed and trained horses as a young woman. Some people, I think, complain a little bit about this book because she doesn't talk at all about her lovers. And she had 3 husbands and she had children. And that's all off limits. She's not interested in telling you about that. And for me, that really worked for me because I just think women are kind of expected to wear their heart on their sleeves. And quite frankly, what was more interesting to me were these incredible adventures she had. She was utterly fearless. Wonderful book. Definitely top read for 2020.
Every time I hear you talk about it, I immediately think, yes, I'm going to go and read that. And then every time I kind of end up not quite. It's crazy. It's been on my TBR all year. And I have the illustrated West with the Night, which I got almost without meaning to, but I got a secondhand copy and that's what came. And so it has all these amazing pictures. So yeah, can't wait to read it.
I'm so envious of that. Because one of the things that I insisted on doing kind of for my own mental health was I would leave my phone outside the room during these nap times because otherwise I would just start Googling the news. You know, it was the height of lockdown. It was very stressful. And so I was always quite frustrated because what I really wanted to do was Google all these different locations that she was in and get a sense of what they looked like beyond her writing.
Well, maybe I will read it and then I'll ship it out to you.
Yeah, please do.
Okay, let's hear from a fellow podcaster. It's Simon Thomas from the Stuck in a Book blog and the podcast Tea or Books. What I love about Simon is he's always seeking out books from the past, the kind of hidden gems that are forgotten, overlooked, and always such interesting recommendations. Here's his favourite read from 2020 and one he's looking forward to in 2021.
One of the books I've loved most in 2020 is a reprint. It's A House in the Country by Ruth Adam, which is sort of non-fiction, sort of fictionalized non-fiction about a time, I think in the 30s, when Ruth Adam decided with about 7 other people to rent an enormous Tudor mansion in the countryside because they thought we could never afford this on our own, but maybe if we club together, we can live here. It tells you in the first lines that it all goes horribly wrong, so you're not shocked when it does. But it's somehow both charming and delightful as well as being a cautionary tale, and I love that. There's quite a few books I'm looking forward to next year, all by the same author, and again, all reprints. But one of my favourite authors is Marjorie Sharp, who is wonderful at comedy and also wonderful at more poignant books. And Dean Street Press, under their furrowed Middlebrow imprint, are republishing many of her hard-to-find novels in January 2021. There's lots that I've had my eye on for years, but I'm not willing to spend hundreds of pounds on them, and now I'll be able to get them.
And you can find the links to Simon's podcast in our show notes.
So before we get to the drum roll moment of our favourite books of 2020, shall we have a few of our book club's recommendations?
Oh yeah, I'm dying to know. What did your lot recommend?
Oh, they were very good. Well, actually, I say they were very good. We communicate on a WhatsApp group, and I asked them to tell me their favorite books of 2020, and it was total radio silence for 24 hours. And I was like, and I had asked them to tell me their favorite books with like a short little paragraph, and I think maybe that paralyzed them. So then I was like, just tell me the names. That's all I need. Just tell me the names. And then there was kind of an outpouring from everyone, and they sort of fed off each other. So I have a few, but I'll go through it quite quickly. From Orla, who's one of my favorite readers. She always recommends great books to me. She says it's a toss-up between Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland, which is a 2019 book by Patrick Radden Keefe, or Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams, which we've talked about on the pod, Under the Net by Iris Murdoch, and Girl, Woman, Other, though you two are on the same page. My dear friend Joe said, for me, Beloved by Toni Morrison and the Rachel Cusk trilogy were my favorites, the middle book especially. So that is Outline, Transit, and Kudos. Have you read those?
I have. I'm not a huge Rachel Cusk fan, although I really love, like Deborah Levy, actually, I really love her non-fiction writing.
Okay.
But now I'm hesitating because I think Outline, Transit, and Kudos are memoirs, aren't they? No, they're fiction. Aren't they fiction? Are they auto-fiction?
I don't know. We'll find out.
There's a collection of her essays called Coventry that I have a copy of. That one of the essays from that is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever read. So I definitely like some of her writing. I was going to say, it was so nice to hear Say Nothing flagged up by Orla, because that's one of the books that I didn't finish. There were quite a few things in 2020 that I started and I kind of couldn't really settle to, and I ended up not finishing them. And Say Nothing was one of them, but it was a strange one because actually, as I was reading it, I thought it was completely incredible. It's the most compelling story of the IRA and the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And it reads like a thriller, like a kind of murder mystery thriller, to the extent that I actually found myself really troubled by just how compulsive and thrilling it was, given that it's dealing with real life events and true history. I sort of thought, gosh, should I be enjoying this much? And I didn't finish it. And I mentioned it to Phil in your book club, and it's appeared on the podcast a few times. And he said, oh, you have to finish it, because in the end, he actually solves this murder mystery that it opens with at the beginning, this disappearance.
Well, Phil says he solves it. I mean, I suppose he kind of does, but innocent until proven guilty, right? No one was ever convicted for it.
Such an interesting read. Absolutely one I want to go back to.
Next up is Alice H., and her favourite was Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Like you, she's a bit nervous. She says, I feel like that's not a very interesting pick because so many people rave about it. I did think it was a bit writerly and overly self-consciously poetic at times, but I really got into it and I can still picture scenes and characters from it in my head. I bought that for my mum for Christmas, because Phil said it was one of the best books in passing, not in this list, incidentally, but he had told me that he loved it so much. So I thought, oh, I'll pick that up for her. Alice is also a children's author, and so she's been reading lots of kids' books this year for work and also because she loves them. And she says she would genuinely recommend A Kind of Spark by Ellie McNichol, which is about an autistic girl trying to get her Scottish village to put in a monument to the woman killed in their witch trials. It's been Book of the Month at Waterstones. Despite being from a small press, it's so good. The author is autistic herself, and she's very passionate about Own Voices books. I interviewed her for my kids' book newsletter a while back, and she's great.
Oh, I think I want to know about the kids' books newsletter. Can we have the link for that in the show notes?
Yes, I'll add that for sure. So many good recommendations. All right, I'll speed up a bit. Charlie says he's struggling to remember what he read this year, but Stasiland by Anna Funder, he'd definitely recommend. Great starting point for getting your head around life in East Germany. These Truths by Jill Lepore is a vast history of the US that I really liked. Maybe take it chapter by chapter instead of trying to read it all in one go. And Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson, which is about Japanese Americans during World War II. Another book club member piped up that they had loved that too. Our other Alice C., says, I think The Mirror and the Light would be my obvious pick. The reason I'm laughing is because Alice is in the civil service and we rib her about her devotion to Thomas Cromwell as the ultimate bureaucrat. She says, I also really enjoyed Happiness by Eminata Forna and The Heartland, which is non-fiction about schizophrenia by Nathan Filer. She says, oh, and also What I Loved by Siri Hustvedt, which Alice H. said is one of my all-time faves. I've never even heard of What I Love.
I read it, I liked it, I can't remember it. It's one of those.
And then Phil, hey, you guys were very much on the same page. Phil says, for me, it would be Hamlet, Shuggie, Bain, and then D. Lampedusa's Leopard, and also The Great Sea, which is David Abulafia's History of the Mediterranean. He also loved Say Nothing and The Ocean Vuong, as I remember. And he says, and all those Cazalet books. I always feel a bit naughty. I mean, when I was pregnant and then when I had my daughter, we did miss out discussions about some of the book club books that we had read. You know, there was no episodes made about them. And one of those was The Light Years, which is the first book in the Cazalet.
Love that series.
My book club love that series, and they regularly have an aside.
She's like an English Elena Ferrante.
I don't like that. I find them really
did you not get
dull.
into them?
I suppose in the same way that I didn't keep reading Elena Ferrante. No, I'm a total outlier. And as I say, my book club, they've sort of rationed them. We read the first one together, and then they've separately read the next books, kind of one by one, but keeping them for the perfect moment where they would enjoy it the most. And they always are talking about them, and I just kind of tune out and, I don't know, look out the window.
I remember loving them when I read them, but they haven't stayed with me particularly. And funny enough, I just recommended them to someone who was looking for good family sagas to read. And I was like, oh, you'll love these so much because I remember loving them, but I couldn't really describe them or anything helpful like that. I was just like, check them out. You'll love them.
Well, on that theme, Frances loved London Belongs to Me by Norman Collins, which is multi-perspective pre-World War II London. And she describes it as a working class alternative to my beloved Cazalets, as she says. And she also loved On Chapel Sands by Laura Cummings, nonfiction based on family history and strange workings of a Lincolnshire village, with loads of art history.
I want to read that one. That's been on my TBR for a long time. Okay, shall I run through mine? There's one book that comes up quite a few times, and it's not going to surprise anyone, that it's Hamlet. I wonder if it was because I read it quite quickly when it came out, because I really love Maggie O'Farrell, and then I raved about it. So maybe I think a few people then picked it up quite quickly after that. Although I'm sure they would have come to it anyway. It wasn't just my endorsement. Amanda, I absolutely loved Hamlet, and I would say that it's been my most pleasurable and immersive read of the year. But the book that got me back to reading after the trauma of lockdown, and she says when escapist pap like crawdads just couldn't cut it, was Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. I just loved its dark, anarchic, quirky, existential, environmentalist and feminist spirit. The natural world taking vengeance on humans with a little help from a slightly crazy, solitary lady living on the edge of a forest. Perfect for a pandemic. And then Maria, who's Italian, her top reads from 2020 were Natalia Ginzburg's Family Lexicon and Maggie O'Farrell's Hamlet. She says both books tell of family and family ties. My heart leans towards Ginzburg, whose books and life never stop moving and inspiring me. She was part of the Italian resistance, worked for Einaudi, and was from a milieu of Italian intellectuals. Besides her own writing, she also translated Proust and, among others, Pinter for the Italian publisher. But Maria says she gives top spot to Hamlet. I think the sense of time and place of O'Farrell's writing is wonderful. The way Shakespeare's genius is kept behind the scenes, while the limelight is on his other half, is done so well. And reading of the plague and effect on a family and community, particularly now, was poignant. Agnes is a great heroine, resourceful and resilient in a life not always easy, and the book satisfied both a historical interest and an emotional response. I think it's a celebration of motherhood and wifehood and women in history, written in such an elegant way that despite all subtleties was very powerful.
I should just say that my book club is reading Family Lexicon in the coming month.
So we'll be doing it for the pod.
There should eventually be an episode about it.
Great, I'd never heard of it before. Know anything about it? That sounds good. Sally, I too would probably nominate Hamlet. Despite the premise of suffering due to plague, I found it a book I could lose myself in, to be immersed in a different time and place while being moved and inspired by the universality of the emotional bonds and travails. She says, oddly, I haven't read as much this year as usual and have found it a bit more difficult to get stuck into books. With several that I've started and although quite enjoying, have put them aside and not gone back to. Me too, same. One that stood out for me was The Secrets We Kept by Lara Prescott, which is about Dr. Zhivago and the way in which dissemination of translations of it were made by the CIA, a mix of spy story and literary biography. That sounds good, doesn't it?
That sounds really good.
I've got two Andys in my book club. I've got Andy K and Andy H. Your Andy. Andy K said, my favourite read is a bit of a laggardly one. Sally lent me her copy of Other Minds by Peter Godfrey Smith. That's the book about octopuses and how they're basically more intelligent than us. He says, it was just as good as everyone said, a wonderful way of not just gawping at nature, but examining what the otherness of these creatures can tell us about our own thought processes and physiology. I loved it. And last but not least, Andy H said, two books I'd like to recommend that I read this year are relatively old but stand out. I'm not sure anything new blew me away, maybe because everything was so overhyped and disappointing, and I tend not to buy hardbacks. He's a hard man to please, Andy H. The first I read during the halcyon sunny days of early lockdown 1.0, The Pike by Lucy Hughes Hallett. The biography of Gabriele D'Annunzio, poet, seducer and preacher of war. It won the Samuel Johnson Prize in 2013. I'd seen it often and been put off because it's over 600 pages, and I'd never heard of D'Annunzio until his appearance in The Unfinished Palazzo, which, you remember, we read for book club and we did an episode on it. That's episode 27 for anyone who wants to seek that one out. And he goes on, it's an amazing book, so rich and detailed, but what a life this man led. If you wanted to invent a novel covering the rise of European and Italian nationalism, art, politics, war and sex during the first half of the 20th century, with a protagonist who is physically and emotionally unattractive, but with such charisma that he has a chain of non-serial lovers and is fated by politicians and the avant-garde, you would never believe this character is real. He seems too far-fetched and unbelievable. He was hideously attractive. It's one of the best biographies I've ever read of someone I've never heard of.
I think, oh gosh, I feel a reading retreat coming up. I want to read everything.
I just want to go on a retreat from my life so that I can just sit and read.
Exactly.
That's my dream. For fiction, he says, I discovered Kevin Barry recently, reading his Night Boat to Tangier, but I look back at his previous books and found The City of Bohan. Do you think you pronounce that? Bohane?
Sounds about right.
The City of Bohan. It was shortlisted for the 2011 Irish First Novel Award. It's a story of the underside of a fictional West Coast Irish city, full of strange gangs, fashions, a mishmash of punked-up late 20th century underground youth cultures. A city of hoods, herb, fetish parlours, grog pits, needle alleys, dream salons and Chinese restaurants. The writing is sizzling off the page as only Irish writers seem to be able to do. I would reread whole passages to feel the language on my tongue. It's rollicking, inventive, surreal and hilarious.
Gosh, they sound so good. I'm with Andy. I do feel like the Irish writers are on a real roll. I mean, I think they probably always have been, and I'm just very, very late to the party.
Yeah, quite often I read the book reviews in the Irish Times, and then recently it went behind a paywall, which is totally fair enough. Newspapers can't just give away all this content for free. And I had to subscribe because I missed them so much, because their writing about books is so good. I love the Irish Times and the way they write about books. Luckily, it's not very much, but yeah, and because it is just such a flourishing literary culture that they have over there and all these gems that, yeah, I think now are kind of much more popping up over here, which is great, and as it should be. Really, thanks for that, Sally Rooney. And speaking of recommendations from over the water, we've got one more special guest, and that is Claire Handscombe of the Brit Lit podcast.
My favourite book of the year is a book I haven't really heard much about, and it deserves to be much better known. It's called What You Wish For, and it's by Catherine Center. It drew me right in with an engaging, warm and witty narrative voice. I relate deeply to the main character, Samantha, who had to leave her previous job as a school librarian because her unrequited crush on the teacher there made her life hell. And I have certainly known my fair share of crushes that are pretty much unbearable. Since then, she's found a job at a legendary elementary school and a home and a community there, and she's really happy and everything's going great. And then her unrequited crush gets hired as the principal of her lovely school. And so, horror of horrors, not only is he back in her life, but he's also not the lovely, fun-loving, joyful man that she fell in love with. Instead, he's a serious rule enforcer who might destroy everything that's precious about the school. Sam is determined to save the school as she knows it, and also to find out what happened to Duncan and why he's changed so much. It's an excellently told, engrossing story about finding hope and love in the midst of tragedy. It teaches us to find joy in the messiness and complications of life, but it's not at all preachy. It's just a really well-told story. So yeah, I highly recommend What You Wish For by Catherine Center. And I think the book I'm most looking forward to next year is a book called The Other Black Girl by Zakiya Dalila Harris. And it's Get Out meets The Devil Wears Prada is how I've heard it described, but set in the publishing industry. So it's basically everything I love. I love the kind of gossip behind the scenes stuff about the publishing industry. And it's going to address race pretty head on, I think, and also have that creepy what's happening here vibe of the movie Get Out. So I think it's going to be great.
And you can catch up with Claire and her podcast at britlitblog.com.
We've made it to the end. So without further ado, what was your favourite read of 2020? Your favourite non-obvious read of 2020?
I'm going to do a drum roll. Can you hear that?
I can hear it.
My favourite, well, it's not actually super non-obvious. It's In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. I only say that because certainly it's popped up on lots of people's standout books of 2020 lists. It is a memoir of a relationship gone bad. It traces the full arc of a harrowing experience with a charismatic but volatile woman. Each chapter views the relationship through a different lens as Machado holds events up to the light and examines them from distant angles. She casts a critical eye over legal proceedings, fairy tales, Star Trek and Disney villains, as well as iconic works of film and fiction, infusing all with her characteristic wit, playfulness and openness to inquiry. The result is a powerful book that explodes our ideas about what a memoir can do and be. I absolutely loved this. I loved everything about it. Her writing is just so good. It's mesmerizing. I love the story that she was telling and the way that she sort of lets you see into her heart. Absolutely, you just feel for her every step of the way. I loved the way that it was structured. It is incredibly clever and inventive, and yet without ever feeling like it's messing around with the form to be clever. It doesn't ever feel like that. You don't ever sort of see through it in that way. It just keeps it interesting. It keeps it so interesting because you never know from one chapter to the next how the story is going to be told, in what way it's going to be told to you next. And I loved that. So it was endlessly surprising. And it has this really compulsive hook, which is that she's in this abusive relationship with this other woman who at the beginning seemed to be everything that she was looking for. She seemed to be someone who would complete her as a person. And you see this relationship unraveling, and it's really just about when is she going to get the inner strength and conviction to pull herself away and leave this relationship. And then there's just this great twist where suddenly it pivots and goes in a completely different direction. And you're, where did that come from? Which I love. It made me smile when you get to it. It's really funny the way it wrong foots you. I loved everything about it. Since reading it, I've watched a few interviews and readings that she's done, and she's just so great as well. She's just one of those people who's really interesting kind of speaker, someone really interesting to listen to. So I loved it. I just absolutely loved it. Yeah, it was probably my favourite of my many favourites that I read in 2020.
It does sound brilliant. I need to head to the library. The good news about finding a library is that I don't need to worry about buying these books. I can just put them on the wait list and pick them up for free.
That's what I always think. That's why I love the library. It's because you go and you feel, as you say, like you're sort of stealing the books, but they want you to take them. They want you to take them away.
Okay.
Yes.
It's now my turn for a drum roll,
yeah.
which I'm... Okay, it is A Drop of Patience by William Melvin Kelly. And I always worry that I don't do his books justice, because you were just so eloquent then describing In the Dream House and putting forward its originality and its magic and, even its plot. And for me, what's so surprising about William Melvin Kelly, who we have talked about in the past, Kate's very familiar with him, is how simple his novels are. We did... Apologies for people who I'm repeating myself, but we did A Different Drummer, which is his better known novel, which was first published in 1962 and then sort of rediscovered by a journalist who wrote about it in The New Yorker, was brought back into print both in America but in the UK by River Run Books, and they did a beautiful job with the editions. It's very rare for publishers to send us books, but in this case, River Run Books heard us talking about A Different Drummer and said, "Would you like to read A Drop of Patience?" And I said, "Yes, please, definitely." And they sent it to me. And I think it's even better than A Different Drummer. It is a story of Ludlow Washington, who is born blind, and he is left at the age of 5 in a brutal white-run state institution for blind African-American children. And if you want to read a devastating first chapter, this book has it. And at this state-run institution, these blind children are taught how to play instruments. That seems to be the only way that they'll ever make a living. And Ludlow is a bit of a prodigy. So at the age of 16, he's sort of purchased by a band leader to come and play with him in the local city of New Marseille, which is a fictional city. And from there, Ludlow ends up in New York in the heyday of the jazz age, creates an astounding reputation for himself, at the same time is haunted by his demons, as you might imagine. What is so unusual about this book is that it is told from the perspective of a blind person, And so the emphasis is always on the sounds and the perception of where people are in a room and the small little things that make him able to piece together the world around him. And that could become tiresome, you might imagine. And yet it doesn't. It's just transporting. You feel like you were in someone else's body where sight is non-existent. And therefore, how do you encounter the world? And then, of course, you have this thread of music throughout, with Ludlow understanding music in a different way from the people around him. And later on, because he becomes quite famous, people talking to him about his art form, but that's not how he understands it. And then as a black blind man, how he comes to terms with race in America and the differences between black and white people. And there's a devastating romance with a white woman, all told in quite straightforward, simple prose that is just perfect. It is a phenomenal book. It's a classic that's been truly forgotten and shouldn't be. You haven't read this one yet either, have you, Kate?
No, and again, I'm thinking, oh, yes, this sounds so good. I really want to read this. I just need you at my elbow when I'm in that crucial moment between books.
Well, same. I'm desperate to read your first choice. So maybe that can be our promise to each other heading into 2021.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. I often need a little nudge, so that's great. Have you got any reading resolutions for 2021? Anything you're going to try and make a point of doing?
I think it's time to step away from the comfort reads because too often they are disappointing. Like, I've read a lot of rubbish this year. And the reality is that when you find a really good book, it's not a chore. Like, if that makes sense, like A Drop of Patience sounds challenging and sad, as does Hamlet, which was one of your favorites. And that actually keeps putting me off Hamlet. But the reality is that these books, when they're of that caliber, they take you somewhere really special. And so, yes, my resolution is to stop reading nonsense and maybe double down on some of the recommendations you've made and my book club.
And I think my resolution is more of a hope, really, which is that I'm going to get a bit more time for reading this year. Last year, 2020, was the year of no reading for me. Well, obviously I did manage to squeeze in quite a lot, but relatively to how much I normally read, it was not that much for me. So I'm hoping I'll be able to power up a bit in 2021. There's just so much to get through.
Yeah, may everyone be in good health and the schools reopen and the virus disappear. That's nearly it for this episode. Thank you for listening and for another year of the Book Club Review. If you missed it, 2020 was the year we finally got together our own website. We're fairly proud of it, so do check that out at thebookclubreview.co.uk. There you'll find detailed show notes and podcast links from this episode, as well as over 80 episodes and a growing library of bookish articles.
Coming up next is our first book club show of 2021, which will be on Writers and Lovers by Lily King and Early Work by Andrew Martin, two American novels that deal both with the craft of writing and romantic relationships.
Until then, as we were such busy bees over Christmas this year, you can catch up with our two other special episodes. First, our Book Club Book of the Year, in which we reviewed all the book club books we read in 2020 and crowned our favourites. That's episode number 83.
And secondly, our literary quiz episode, in which we were joined by Gary Wigglesworth, author of the Book Lovers Quiz Book. He set us some novel conundrums, and then we got our own back by quizzing him. And that was episode number 84.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RBW Pod, or you can email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? And if you like what we do, please take a moment to rate and review the show because it helps other listeners find us.
But for now, that's our show. Thanks for listening and happy reading.